Hey everyone, my name's Francois. I'm a choreographer, dance instructor, and my specialty is authentic jazz dance, particularly the Lindy Hop.
Hi, Ryan. Thank you so much
Hey,
for
sing.
taking the time to come and talk to us. And the reason why I really wanted to talk to you was I was hoping you could shed some light on the history of jazz because, especially in Asia, it's not jazz is not part of our culture, and we have very maybe waffly ideas of what jazz is, let alone about the history of jazz. So I was hoping you could share with us and shed some light on it for us.
Well, I'm very happy to be talking about the history of jazz. I want to talk about the history of jazz from the perspective of the history of the Lindy Hop. Jazz is a wide subject covering the singing, the music, and the dancing. And so we're going to narrow in and talk about the Lindy Hop and its development along the lines of jazz. To start, you always have to start from the beginning. So I have to mention the African diaspora. What African diaspora means is it's the worldwide collection of communities descended from native Africans, i.e., the people of Africa, predominantly who were brought to the Americas and the West, mainly as enslaved people, and propagated themselves and actually created all the art forms that we associate with jazz. Um, I'm not going to go deeply into what happened to enslaved Africans, but at a certain point, a man came along called William Henry Lane. He was also known as Master Juba. He's considered to be the originator of the thing that we call American tap dance. But also, he is responsible for the very nature of the vernacular art forms that we associate with jazz. Vernacular, actually, again, is just a word that means of the people, folk dances, folk stories and ideas, and we associate it often with the use of the words jazz and jazz dance. So you might hear me say vernacular more than once. So Master Juba, his name was William Henry Lane. He was considered to be the greatest jazz dancer of his time. And he gave us the beginnings of the jazz dance steps and movements that we do in both the Lindy Hop and in what we nowadays call solo jazz. His specialties moved to a dance called the cakewalk, and the cakewalk was the beginnings for us as Lindy Hoppers in joining the world of ballroom dance and partnering. The cakewalk was a simple dance that was emulating the movements of the slave master and his behavior at the social events and balls. So very much connected to the dances of the royal court, like the minuet and the waltz. The cakewalk was the black slaves' way of parodying and in some ways making fun of their slave masters. They would wear top hats, twirl canes, and strut and hop around, and they became so good at that their masters offered a cake to the best dancing couple, and essentially that's how the dance became known as the cakewalk. The cakewalk spurred a movement within American entertainment that became known as minstrelsy. The minstrel was not a black entertainer. Actually, a minstrel was a white entertainer, blacked up in their face with cork to look like a black person, and in many ways just to make fun of their affectations and their behavior and it was often used to demoralize black people. But it created a circuit for entertainers, which black people like William Henry Lane, Master Juba, would eventually join. And this circuit was called the TOBA, which means the Theater Owners Booking Agency. You may hear at some point in time the word the TOBA break, which is a dance step that's named after the Theater Owners Booking Agency and the minstrelsy era. In the minstrel era, slaves realized that they could become entertainers and therefore no longer slaves. And it was a great route for them to kind of escape working on the fields and to do something that actually brought a different sense of pride and respect for themselves. This was a long-running time of almost 100 years of entertainment that was done via the minstrel circuit and allowed the jazz dances to develop. They developed along two lines, one being the partner dances, which were born out of the cakewalk, and the other being the solo dances born out of the styles of Master Juba and others that were to follow. These combinations often were presented in what we call a craze, i.e. that like a step became so popular that everybody wanted to do that step, and it became a craze for the entire population. So you could have a craze of people pecking their heads like chickens, shaking their knees, and doing what we call rubber legs. And the most prevalent craze, which came eventually in the 1920s, was a thing called the Charleston. The Charleston is the cornerstone of all the art forms that eventually led towards this thing called the Lindy Hop. So in the middle of the Charleston era, which is the beginning, actually around 1918 and the beginning of the 1920s, because the social habit was to go to clubs and dance and interact without TV, without the internet, without the radio even. So people met and they went to clubs in Harlem to dance. In the midst of all this, there was a change of the style of music. We moved from this ragtime sound to what became known as big band swing. A man called Jelly Roll Morton, or it could be argued it was W.C. Handy. They changed the style of music away from 2/4 rhythm to 4/4 rhythm, which made it really smooth. In the birth of this era, the clubs started to grow, mainly a place called the Cotton Club and a very famous arena where the Lindy Hoppers eventually came to congregate, called the Savoy Ballroom. In 1926, the Savoy Ballroom was opened. They were playing still that ragtime sound. And the dancers were doing a mix of the Charleston as they brought themselves dancing together in a kind of partner dance style of the Charleston instead of solo, which brought it to a man out as a real special, a specialist of dancing the Charleston and mixing it into a new thing that they were calling the breakaway. His name was Shorty George Snowden. He was really considered the father of this thing called the Lindy Hop. Shorty mixed the Charleston as a partner dance with the breakaway, And it was as it sounded. It was basically dancing together and then letting go and breaking away. And he combined these two things together and would compete in like dance marathons to show off this new way of dancing. Meanwhile, a year later, in 1927, a man named Charles Lindbergh flew the first solo flight across the Atlantic from New York to Paris. He was so popular and it was such a milestone that virtually everything was being named after him. They named streets, bars, clubs, tables, everything after Lindbergh. Shorty, it is said, in that moment, decided to call the dance that he was doing, earlier known as the breakaway, and he renamed it the Lindy Hop, or the Lindbergh Hop, if you want to think of it that way. At this given time, the Savoy Ballroom, as I said, had opened in 1926, and the music began to change to this smoother style of big band swing. New band leaders emerged: Count Basie, Duke Ellington, eventually Benny Goodman, Fletcher Henderson, many other names that exist in that era. But the dancing also began to sophisticate itself into this thing called the Lindy Hop. This created a dance company started by a man called Herbert White, who was the bouncer at the Savoy Ballroom, and he got together the young, talented kids, of which a man called Frankie Manning became one of, and he created a dance troupe called Whitey's Hopping Lindy Hoppers. This rang in the era of the Lindy Hop, and not only was the Lindy Hop the dance of the day, it became known as America's one and only home-created folk dance. The Lindy, as it became known, became famous across the world. Everybody was dancing the Lindy Hop, but the best dancers congregated in the Savoy Ballroom with Whitey, and Frankie Manning was one of those people. They eventually started to make movies, and since the movie era actually coincides with the birth of the Lindy Hop, because the first talking movie was made in 1927. It was movies were silent movies up to this point, but in 1927, the same year that Lindbergh hopped the Atlantic, Al Jolson appeared in a new talking picture called The Jazz Singer. And from here on in, they started to make movies. The Lindy Hoppers got in on the movies, and they made two significant movies. One called A Day at the Races, which starred the Marx Brothers. And the second, which was considered to be the highlight of basically the best Lindy Hop's performance that still has ever been seen, was in a movie called Hell's a Poppin'. In Hell's a Poppin', Frankie Manning came to the fore as emerging as probably the best Lindy Hopper of his time. He choreographed the sequence and organized the dances, and he also performed as the last couple, Frankie and Ann Johnson, delivering Lindy Hop and the air steps, which had emerged at this point at its highest peak. So the Lindy Hop was not just a dance created for the movies. It was very much part of the social structure of how people danced in the ballrooms, particularly in the Savoy ballroom. They would congregate in the Savoy, where it was the biggest ballroom in the world. It was a block long, and it was big enough. The dance floor was big enough to have a band at both ends. Well, the northeast corner, I believe, they named the corner for the best dancers in the room. They called it the Cat's Corner. In Cat's Corner, all the best dancers would do their thing. This was not only where the best dancers would congregate, it's also where they would create. And often they would make more crazes, more dances, more dance styles. They would develop things like the Big Apple and the Trunky Do. And it was where they tried to outdance each other by competing against each other, friendly and unfriendly, to keep deciding who were the better dancers. The competitive nature of the Lindy Hop and Jazz became attractive, or at least was noticed by a major dance contest they would have in New York City yearly called the Harvest Moon Ball. The Harvest Moon Ball was a competition held at Madison Square Gardens. It was not just for the swing dancers or the Lindy Hoppers. It was a competition for all ballroom dancers. And they created a special division for the Lindy Hoppers because they were so spectacular. It eventually became a showpiece to show off the Lindy Hop, which would become known as the Jitterbug. And they would, in fact, the early clips of film that we can see from the news footage of Pathé News can show you how the Lindy Hoppers were looking and performing at the Harvest Moon Ball, because this was the arena that really set a standard for how the dancers, or who were the best dancers. If you won the Harvest Moon Ball, you won the title of, you were able to say, I'm the best Lindy Hopper in the world, and you would get a contract at the Cotton Club to perform. So this was a very prestigious thing to be involved in, and often Lindy Hoppers were distinguished by whether or not they had won the Harvest Moon Ball. This tradition and the Savoy Ballroom and the films and the movies, all of this continued on all through the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, and then something happened. We hit the Second World War. In the Second World War, all the dancers who were of age were recruited into the war effort, and therefore, like musicians, dancers, singers, whoever they were, they now had to join the war effort. And so the dancing stopped, or slowed would be a better word to put it. A new generation of dancers appeared, mainly coming out of a place called the Renaissance Ballroom, producing young performers like a man called Pepsi Bethel. And those performers replaced the original dancers, Frankie Manning's group of White is Lindy Hoppers, and even Shorty Snowden's dance company. And they performed as White is during the war years. The war was a turning point, not just for the dance, but also for the identity of the dancers. The dance started to become associated with the white performers. and the GIs. And so we moved from understanding Lindy Hop to be a black dance from the Savoy Ballroom to more of a white dance, renamed the Jitterbug, and propagated via the GIs to other countries. And that's where history kind of changed. The original Lindy Hoppers, when they came back from the war, they didn't have the jobs that they had before. They mainly split up and started to work in regular jobs. The Jitterbug continued its history, or its kind of white history, and moved into the 50s era, moving with it and changing its name to rock and roll and jive and things that we recognize now. But the Lindy Hoppers were still around, they just weren't dancing. Then something wonderful happened in the early 80s. Even though I say that the Lindy Hop had slowed, it hadn't died. There was still embers of the dance being done by people who were keeping it alive, chiefly a woman called Mama Lou Parks. Mama Lou Parks and the Lou Parks dancers, they continued the tradition of Lindy Hop in Harlem all the way through to the 1980s, where because of their efforts, they drew attention to the dance to a new generation, namely my generation. We saw Mama Lou Parks in documentaries, and she would tour to Great Britain, in fact, and she would come and perform, and we would get to see the Lindy Hop as it was done by her performers in the tradition of the original dancers. Learning from Mama Lou Parks, a new generation went out and started to propagate the Lindy back into the world. In doing so, they discovered Frankie Manning. Frankie was working in the post office. He had been doing so for 30 years. But this new interest in the dance inspired him to come out of retirement and to start the resurgence of the dance so that we now today can enjoy the Lindy Hop in its rightful place as one of the main dance styles of the jazz and swing era. With the resurgence, we found a lot more names of a lot more dancers and performers, both in the Lindy world and in the tap world, and many people who were actually part of the swing era. I'm just going to give you some of their names. Al Minns, Norma Miller, Frankie Manning, Dawn Hampton, Pepsi Bethel, George Lloyd, Sonny Allen, Billy Ricker, Barbara Billups, Sugar Sullivan, Mama Lou Parks, Pegleg Bates, Mabel Lee, Murrah Den, and Charlie Meade. And the tap dancers of Buster Brown and Willie Covan. But tap is a whole other story. We could do that another time. All of these dancers were not only stars of their era, they became stars of our era because they helped us to understand the dances that we now do and how to do them authentically, because they were the ones who created the movements that we enjoy today. So if you've joined our wide Lindy Hop community and you're very new to this dance, understand that you're joining something that has a 300-year history, again beginning with the African diaspora, the moving of Africans to the Americas, the creation of jazz, and the birth of swing. It's a wide subject, and there are many things that you can find out about it, and it's an enjoyable journey just to spend time learning about the dance that you're doing. I suggest that you buy a book. If you do one thing, buy Frankie Manning's book called The Ambassador of Lindy Hop, and you will learn all the wonderful things about the dance that you do. If you buy another book, get Jazz Dance by Marshall and Gene Stearns. This is the vernacular history of the dance, of jazz dance, including the Lindy Hop. And you will be exposed to a wonderful world of the dance that you have just begun. And I hope you enjoy every day that you do it, because Lindy Hop is the best.
Thank you, Ryan.
Later, 1927, Charles Lindbergh flew the first solo flight in an airplane across the Atlantic from Paris to New York. Or maybe the other way around.
Other way.
Sorry. Pigleg Bates, he was around, so was Maybelline.
Oh, yes.
See, you give me more work here. See, all right. So now I've got 4 sheets. Sonny Allen, Billy Ricker, Barbara Billups, Pegleg Bates, Maybelline, Joy Today.
Yay. Okay, Rebecca,